So welcome, everyone. Good morning. My name is Jason Bordoff. I'm a professor at Columbia School of International Public Affairs. I direct the Center on Global Energy Policy, and it's our pleasure to welcome back to Columbia Eirik Wærness, the chief economist at Statoil, senior vice president at Statoil, to present their Energy Perspectives 2017, which was just released from Statoil. It's a time, I think it's fair to say, when I don't envy the challenge that Eirik and his team have to try to tell us what the world's going to look like in 2050, given how many things are up in the air and how uncertain the energy outlook seems to be. We see oil demand growth being revised up each of the last few years, but we're talking about peak oil demand, and the world's going to be getting potentially off of oil at some time in the sooner than people thought. Global natural gas markets are being turned on their head. The U.S. is now a significant exporter of natural gas and is going to become even more so by the end of the decade. Renewable costs falling far more quickly than people thought. New questions and uncertainty about the outlook for climate policy around the world, with nations in some cases ramping up their ambition, and in some cases, including from the U.S., walking away from the agreement entirely. So, plus technology developments, questions about the future of personal mobility and what sorts of disruptive innovations will no doubt come about that we can't even anticipate today. So in effort to try to think through what the future is going to look like in 1 or 2 years, nevertheless, 30 or 40 is a difficult one, maybe as difficult as it's ever been in the energy sector. And that's why it's so helpful for us to have some of the world's leading experts like Eirik come in and spend time with us and tell us how they're thinking about the future at a company like Statoil, one of the world's largest oil and gas producers, and also increasingly a very large and growing producer of renewable energy, including winning the lease offshore here in New York area off Long Island for what will be the largest offshore wind lease that the U.S. Department of Interior has ever done. So a company that's investing significantly in renewable energy as well, and it'll be interesting to sort of hear him talk a little bit about how, as a company, Statoil views the outlook for all forms of energy and what that means for them to be a resilient company. So we're going to hear the presentation from Eirik about the energy perspectives, and then we'll have a conversation about what's in it with Eirik, with Geoff, who's one of our faculty affiliates and steering committee members at the Center on Global Energy Policy. He's a professor at Columbia Business School and at the School of International Public Affairs. We have several other folks here with good expertise that I want to bring into that conversation, including Antoine Haff, who just walked in, who leads the Oil Market Research Program at the Center on Global Energy Policy. And we'll take questions from the audience. We'll take questions also from those watching online. So I'll just remind those watching online, you're able to ask questions through Twitter at our handle at Columbia U Energy using the hashtag CGEP events. Ask those who are in the room to please silence your cell phones. And the webcast and the podcast of today's event, like all of our events, will be available online a day or two after the event concludes. So with that, let me ask Eirik to come up, and then after he's done, we'll have a conversation. Please join me in welcoming Eirik Wærness to Columbia.
Thanks for the very kind introduction. Good morning, everyone, both here in the room and out there in cyberspace. It's a pleasure to be back. This is the 7th edition of Energy Perspectives. It's a piece of independent analytical work done by my team and myself, summarizing some of the views that we have and that we have to give to our Chief Executive Committee and the Board of Directors when they make investment decisions and strategic priorities. And we summarize that and want to participate in a public debate and a fact-based debate on where the global energy markets might go. It's, as such, not Statoil's strategy. This is a piece of independent analytical work, and not a single word in the publication was approved by the Corporate Executive Committee or the Board of Directors before it went to print. I think they approve of the work, I hope that, but they didn't approve the work. For the first time, we'll look to 2050, and as Jason alluded to, looking 35 years into the future, that means that the possible outcome space become huge and wide. especially when you're thinking about global energy markets and not focusing only on tiny small bits of that, but we take the whole thing. And the front page of the report and the front page of the slide pack here illustrates that energy is big. The global energy system is huge and is growing, and the level of development where energy is being demanded is very different. The type of energy supply that we depend on is also very varied. So when you look then 35 years into the future, the pathways the world might take are very different. As a consequence of that, we have over the last years developed not one forecast, but a series of scenarios, three scenarios to be precise, which tell stories about where the world might go, depending on the weight you put on different types of drivers and assumptions. And that's what I'm going to focus on, and I'm going to talk a lot about the 2-degree target, and a scenario that is consistent with the 2-degree target, but keep reminding you that that's only one of the three possibilities that we're looking at. And think about the range of outcomes as what we see as the most likely outcome. It's huge, and the actual development will probably be somewhere in that range, and not go according to each of these scenarios. So we have three scenarios. They're called renewal, reform, and rivalry. The light blue scenario, the renewal scenario, that's the one we should all hope for, because it's a scenario that delivers the highest economic growth to 2050, the best improvement in energy intensity, and it delivers a CO2 trajectory from the energy sector that is consistent with the 2-degree target with a 50% probability, according to IPCC and IEA. Wishing something for Christmas does not mean you get it. So we have to be open to the fact that the world might actually develop in different directions. Reaching the 2-degree target is an enormous challenge. It's something that, if we do it, it's something the world will have never done before, to be able to deliver that. And I'll come back to how challenging it is. So we are catering for other opportunities. The reform scenario, the dark blue one, which is, in terms of outcomes, is the central one. That puts faith in the promises that each country made in the Paris Agreement, the national pledges. So we assume that they will be followed up by measures that work, so that we, towards 2025, 2030, are in the process of the countries delivering. Then gradually, we assume that scenario where policy takes more of a supportive role, and then markets and technology drive the development. That scenario is also definitely not business as usual, delivers a significant change in the energy mix, significant improvement in energy intensity, but does not deliver a reduction in CO2 emissions from the energy sector. So it's not sustainable. Then we have another scenario, rivalry, the orange one, where we cater for the possibility that other issues, other concerns, other priorities than energy and climate policy might affect political decision-making, market development, our ability to act commonly in the interest of the common good. A scenario where we put more weight on security of supply concerns. A scenario where we act according to the fact that we might not like everybody very well, so we put sanctions in place. We limit economic trade with those we don't like. We develop policies that cater for our own concerns rather than those of the common good. In such a scenario with a lot of conflict, we have much lower economic growth, slower technological development, and results in terms of energy and energy efficiency and CO2 emissions that are much worse in isolation than in the two other scenarios. It's a scenario that is very unpleasant in many dimensions. It's a really bad scenario in parts of the world in terms of conflict levels and low economic growth. But it's definitely a possibility. The three dimensions that define these scenarios is there are three of them. It's how much policy is there in them? There's a lot in the renewal scenario. We do not think it's possible to achieve the 2-degree target without a very strong impetus from policy. The reform scenario and the rivalry scenario are more market-driven. And then there is a difference between the market part of that. To what extent do we have a conducive, constructive market rule, like in the reform and in the renewal scenario, where we have level playing fields, openness to trade, comparative advantage determine who produces what, etc., etc.? Or do we have a protectionist a destructive market rule, where we protect our own industries, where we put in place tariffs and border adjustments for those that we don't like to protect our own industries, etc., etc. We have sanctions, very destructive to market development. That's rivalry. And then the third dimension that distinguishes these scenarios, that is what we don't have a good word in Norwegian nor English, but the Germans have something called Weltanschauung, where the way we look at the world, our global outlook. Is that, as in the renewal scenario, is it global, somewhat altruistic? We realize that we're all in the same boat. We do things for the interest of the common good, and we talk about we. Or are we local, nationalist, regionally focused, protective, even tribal, where we think about us and them? We protect our own industries, we protect ourselves against the Russians, or whoever we don't like. Well, then you're in the rivalry scenario. And then you have absolutely no chance of reaching any climate targets. So that's the difference between these two scenarios, and now these three scenarios, and then we develop assumptions indicating that we could go in very, very different directions. The number one key to deliver on any climate target is that we need a significant, fantastic improvement in global energy efficiency compared to what we have delivered over the last 25 years. The renewal scenario, look in the middle chart, the exponential lines showing GDP. The renewal scenario has the highest average economic growth, 2.7% per year, driven by slightly less than 1% population growth. So we have 2.4 billion new people coming in, a lot of new consumers. They become richer. In total, we become 2.6 times richer by 2050. Absolutely necessary to deliver an enormous improvement in energy efficiency in order not to have CO2 emissions go too high. We deliver 2.8% energy intensity improvement in that scenario, meaning we think it's possible to have an economy doubling in size by 2.6 times, if you like, not using more energy. So in the renewal scenario, we have 94% of the global energy use in 2050 compared to what we have today. An enormous challenge. If we deliver the same type of energy intensity development as we have over the last 25 years in total, energy demand would be more than double what we think it's possible to deliver in the renewal case. Look at the black circle in the right chart. The other two scenarios also deliver higher improvements in energy intensity than what we've seen historically. The good news is that we see some indications over the last couple of years that it is, in fact, possible to decouple GDP growth and energy demand growth, but that has to happen globally and at the scale we haven't seen. If you think that's impossible, then your challenges in terms of changing the energy mix and delivering CO2 reductions will be even higher than what I'm going to tell you on these next slides. The second key to deliver a sustainable development in energy demand is that we have to start speeding up the change in the energy mix. We see a lot of fantastic development in terms of new renewable electricity, fortunately. Costs are coming down. We have 200 times more solar panels on Earth now than we had in 2000, 15 years ago. The result of that revolution, the windmills in Texas, the solar panels in Spain, and the windmills and panels in Germany, is that pink sliver at the top of the 2014 column. So the amount of energy produced by solar panels and windmills constitute less than 2% of total primary energy demand. So decarbonization of the energy mix has not yet started. Fossil fuels constitute more than 80% of the energy mix. They constituted 88% of the energy mix in 1970, and they've been above 80 since 1990. That will change in all scenarios, change rapidly and much more rapidly than what we have seen historically. And delivering on the renewal scenario is basically a revolution, where we take renewable electricity up to 20% of the overall energy mix. We take coal down by 2/3. So total coal demand in 2050 in a population that is, with a global population that is 2.4 billion people more, and we're 6 times richer, coal demand goes down by 2/3. Just think through if you think that's possible. If you don't, please provide another solution for the climate targets. How can we get there? You don't see it here, in spite of a few hybrid taxes on Manhattan. But you see it in Norway, a little bit, but that's the only place you see it. we think that one possible candidate for delivering the change that we need is rapid electrification of light-duty vehicles. Everything that moves that is less than 3.5 tons. So that excludes most of the trucks in Texas, I guess. But everything that's less than 3.5 tons, that can electrify quickly if a few factors combine together. They have to be competitive on price and performance quickly. We think they might be without subsidies within 10 years. The car producers that matter, the big companies, have to provide new models to satisfy fleet emission standards without cheating. So they have to, and they have said they will, provide a lot of battery-driven vehicles, plug-in hybrids, so that we can choose those. If you combine that with the policy drive to reduce local pollution, where diesel is a problem, in cities in Europe, for instance, you could get a very rapid shift. And it has to be extremely rapid for this to deliver. What we have here is 50% of the global sales of cars have to be electric by 2030 in that renewal scenario. 50%. It's less than 1 at the moment. And then you go to 2050, we have 90% electric. Mostly batteries, but it can be hydrogen on fuel cells, and it could be different shares here, but that's what we think. If we do that, combine that with a fantastic improvement in combustion engines, the remaining combustion engines, we reduce oil demand significantly to 2050 from this part of oil demand. This is about 1/4 of global oil demand, 25 million barrels. Look at the other thing that is not visible here, but see, we assume we can have a world in 2050 where we don't sell more cars than we do today, 80 million cars. In a population that's 2.4 billion larger, and where car density is very low now in the parts of the world where the economic growth is the highest and the population is growing and large. That means that we have to have urban structures in the new cities in Asia that makes it possible to live normal middle-class lives in 2050 without reverting to having a car all the time. That's public transportation systems. There's a lot of car sharing as well. But it means that these cities, which we have to build and develop, they have to look more like Paris and Barcelona than Houston and Los Angeles. Otherwise, we'll have much more cars, and the problem is going to be even worse. It's a really bad idea to electrify the car fleet in China today, or Poland. So let's hope they don't do that too fast until the second factor has been allowed to play a role. And the second component that we see makes this change possible is a rapid decarbonization of the electricity sector. Because in China and Poland now, coal is providing 80 to 90% of the electricity. So decarbonizing too soon, or electrifying too soon, is not a good idea. But if this happens, it's a really good idea. Solar panels and windmills provide 5% of global electricity today. That's the result of the revolution that we've seen over the last 15 years. That could grow to 50%. It has to grow to 50% if we're to deliver on the 2-degree target globally. So 50% of all electricity generated on Earth by 2050 in this renewal scenario is provided by solar panel and windmills. We assume that can happen due to regulation, that we have enough batteries to allow that to happen, that we have enough rare earth minerals to allow it to happen, that we have regulatory regimes that incentivize producers to actually invest in something that costs zero to produce when we produce. So where's the income going to come from? That somebody has the gas-fired power in backup, which doesn't run more than a couple of days a year, maybe, but we have to have it. Otherwise, we have blackouts on Christmas Eve and when everybody wants to boil their eggs on Easter morning in Europe after a long, cold winter. So we need that type of backup. If that happens, we almost take coal out of the mix globally. The remaining coal, 50% of that, roughly, slightly less on a global scale, is assumed to be equipped with carbon capture and storage. The electricity share of total final energy consumption is shown in these black circles. In the debate on renewable electricity and decarbonization, it often sounds as if all energy use is electricity. It isn't. 80% of energy use is not electricity. The electricity share of the global final energy consumption is 19%, and it grows historically by 2 percentage points per decade. In this scenario, we let it grow to 30 by 2050, partly because we electrify the cars, which means we double the rate of electrification. But still 70% will not be electricity. Why these two candidates? Well, there's a lot of change going on in the rest of the energy spectrum too, but we think it is difficult to do more than what we have assumed here. What is this? The left chart here is the rest of transportation. Everything that moves that it weighs more than 3.5 tons. So that's trucks, railroads, aircraft, and shipping. And if you think about it, we might have 3 times more aircraft flying in 2050 than today. The consultants for the air industry and the air industry themselves say that we might have a doubling by 2035. If you extrapolate the number of Chinese going in and out of China, the growth rate in that number since 2000 to now, it's 11 doubled. If we extrapolate that growth rate unabated to 2050, which we don't do, we don't believe it's going to happen, but if it were to happen, we would have 23 billion movements of Chinese in and out of the country by 2050. That's a lot of underlying demand for aircraft. So we think there's going to be a lot of more air traffic. In that renewal scenario, we're going to be able to deliver that without increasing the use of oil. It's a tremendous performance. When you have 3 billion new middle-class consumers wanting to go to IKEA every Saturday to buy stuff, like we do, you're going to have a lot more trucking, a lot more goods transportation, a lot more shipping. We can also assume we can do that with an increased amount of gas in the trucking, but also with much more efficient combustion engines, some batteries, et cetera, so we don't increase the energy use. We're going to have electrified bus fleets, partly, and we're going to have all railroads in the world being electric, but we cannot get out of all oil by 2050. And then the right side there shows the distribution of total final energy consumption in the rest of the energy sector, everything that is not electricity or cars, transportation. That's the direct use of gas for cooking in the best restaurants in France. It's the direct use of gas, oil, and coal to provide energy to industrial processes in our steel mills and cement factories, et cetera, et cetera. It's direct use for, and one more important component here is the feedstock component. Use of oil and gas to produce the wall-to-wall carpet you have your feet on. All kinds of products that are made of oil and gas. Try living a day without oil and gas. Who brushed their teeth this morning? Oh, you all did, come on. If we didn't have oil and gas as feedstock, you wouldn't have a toothbrush, you wouldn't have toothpaste. The ladies and the young men wouldn't have cosmetics, and you wouldn't have a car in your garage because a lot of that is made of plastic. You probably wouldn't have a table to sit on, or at least a kitchen bench. Many floors wouldn't be there. That component of energy, of oil and gas demand, we think will grow across the scenarios, any scenario, to 2050, because we're going to have a lot of middle-class consumers. It doesn't provide CO2 in it by itself as well. It gives plastic pollution. But if we decarbonize the energy provided that we need to produce all those polymers, it's going to be a growth component that is delivered without CO2 emissions. So that's one reason why we can't get gas, oil, and coal out of the mix in that part of it. And we need a lot of steel, right, for the railroads, the windmills, and so on. What's steel? That's iron and coal. So we also need coal as feedstock in different types of manufacturing production. So what's the result of all that? Well, in addition to the 40 doubling of solar electricity, the 13 doubling of wind electricity, which we have to invest in, the clear conclusion is that we need a lot of investments in oil and gas as well, even in the 2-degree target. This is a complex chart, but look at the demand figures. First of all, when my boss asked me about what's oil demand going to be in 2050, he was not very happy about the answer, because it's not very precise, right? It's, well, it could be 63 million barrels in the 2-degree target, which would leave oil demand coming back to what it was in 1980, roughly. Or 123, if you think about the rivalry scenario. So that's a plus minus 30% compared to today, really wide. But if you hold on to the 63 million barrel, let's hope you're in the renewal scenario. And then you say, what if the oil and gas industry stopped spending any money, any brain capacity, any capital, any type of technology today? What would production be then? It would fall by 3 to 6% per year, roughly, because of falling pressures in the reservoirs. So we could, by 2050, then potentially only produce 10 million barrels, and demand is 63. And then if you calculate the area under the demand curve, I have analysts who are able to do integrals. I used to do that too, but I'm too old now to remember how to do it, but they did. The white area there, plus the gray shaded, if you think that it might be 6% decline every year, it means we lose the equivalent of the US shale oil production every year. How much new oil did we need? Oil from something that doesn't produce today. Through IOR, investments to move resources into reserves, exploration, find new resources. The top of the light blue column is what we need in the Turkey scenario. 510 billion barrels. That's over the next 35 years, have to produce from something that doesn't produce today. If you compare that with what OPEC has produced the last 35 years, that's the gray column, we need 50% more than what OPEC has produced the last 35 years. And you all know that OPEC produces about 1/3 of global oil. Huge challenge in a situation where top-line demand starts to fall, so it's a bit uncertain how that market is going to look like. But if we don't do that, we don't have enough oil to satisfy demand. If you think oil is difficult, this is the same chart for gas. We might need 50% more new gas over the next 35 years than the combined production of the United States, Russia, and all of Middle East over the last 35 years. And all of Middle East here contains Iran and Qatar, which are 2 of the 4 largest producers of gas, together with Russia and the United States. So this is not about this revolution that is only about renewable electricity. This is about that, but also the need to produce a lot of new oil and gas. And that requires brain capacity, technology, investments, and finance. This is not a walk in the park. And that was the renewal scenario. The world might go in different directions, and then we need even more oil and gas. Thank you.
I have a bunch of questions, but maybe I'll start, Geoff, just by asking for you've thought a lot about what reducing emissions somewhere in the neighborhood of 80% along the lines of a 2-degree scenario would look like by 2050. So in what ways is that outlook similar to, different from what you found? And you've thought a lot about the cost of getting there too, so I'm curious how that lines up with what you saw presented here.
Yeah, well, first of all, I really enjoyed the talk. Great, thank you very much. And I think that, constructing a couple of scenarios is the right way to go about this. As a discussion, I guess we can ask questions like, are these exactly the right scenarios? But perhaps more interesting, what are the chances of these different scenarios being realized? Which is the real tough one, right? Just one comment, you actually didn't talk at all about prices, about the price of oil, and what's going to happen with the price of oil. And that's actually quite important in this context, because what happens to the price of oil is really going to drive the incentives that people have to move from, say, internal combustion engines to electric vehicles. I mean, one of the problems with adoption of EVs in this country is that at this point, the price of gas is so low in the US that it's hard to make an economic case for an electric vehicle. That's not true in Europe, obviously, but it's certainly true here.
In order to make the case for an electric vehicle in Europe, you also need a lot of subsidies, by the way.
You do, that's right. Yeah, right. That's fair enough. I guess from your Renew scenario, what you were saying at the very end now, the price of oil is likely to rise significantly. I mean, you were indicating that we need a lot of new investment to generate the oil and gas that's required there. And that won't be forthcoming unless we have a reasonably high price for oil. We've exhausted a lot of the lower cost sources of oil. So would it be accurate to say that in that scenario, you see oil prices going back up, maybe not to $110 a barrel, but somewhere in the 50 to 100 range?
Well, I think the way we look at that is that, first of all, the price of oil currently is not sustainable. It's not high enough to ensure a normal rate of return across the value chain when you take the whole value chain in, not only for the oil companies, but also for the supplier industry. We have seen a fantastic cost reduction in the oil industry over the last couple of years, even higher than what we've seen in renewable electricity, by the way. Some of the break-even prices have come down by more than 50% over the last couple of years. But the break-even price doesn't cover all the costs associated with the oil industry. It doesn't cover exploration, it doesn't cover all the costs before we make the investment decision, and it doesn't cover my salary, the corporate costs, right? And then it doesn't cost, and also the supplier industry at the moment is not making money. So the price has to come up in all these scenarios. Of course, much more in the rivalry scenario than in the renewable scenario. And what the marginal cost is going to be, or what the cost is going to be of the marginal resource, the last barrel we produce in 2030, if we produce 100 million barrels or 90, nobody knows.
Right.
Probably lower than we thought some years back, because the cost reductions that we've seen are structural. What is important in terms of consumers, and that's why we advocate for these policy changes having to take place immediately, more or less, in the renewable scenario, is the consumer price of oil. And that has to be as high in the renewable scenario with 63 million barrels in 2050 as in the rivalry scenario with 123, in order to ensure the same type of demand, the correction of demand. So that's what we want to. I mean, we're going to see a CO2 price, a carbon price that is in the area of $150 per ton, we think, in the renewable case when you get to 2050. So, and the problem in the US is that carbon is free if you're a car driver. One of the issues is, of course, that when you put a carbon price like a $40 per ton carbon price, that could translate into something like 40 cents per gallon. The question is whether that is enough, but combine that with the emission standards that the United States have and are really tough, by the way, or at least improving, you could get that type of behavior. But it's also a change in behavior. But also it probably will have to be supplemented by local restrictions on cars once the car fleet is there. You can't tell people to buy an electric vehicle now when there's no electric vehicle to buy. But once the fleet is there, the production lines are big enough, and they do compete on price and performance, then the likelihood of getting that change is higher. Whether you can move to 50% by 2030 is probably not very likely. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, this renewal scenario, we think it's realistic in the sense that it's possible. It's not utopia, but it's not realistic in any sense of being probable. It's an enormous challenge. Mm-hmm.
It would require very strong policy measures, wouldn't it? Like you said, it would require a significant carbon tax to shift people. I mean, one of the challenges with electric vehicles is that just the reliability of the current generation of internal combustion engines, which means the average life of a car in the US is 15 years or more. Mm. And so, if you're going to get the internal combustion engines out of the fleet, it takes a long time. Depreciation is very slow on those.
Yeah. So you're both saying, I just want to make sure that there's agreement, policy is critical to get from, I guess, reform to renewal would be the way to think about it, where we're headed today to where what 2 degrees would look like. So the sort of narrative or some of the views you heard, especially after the U.S. withdrew from the Paris Agreement, that this clean energy transformation is unstoppable, market forces are headed there, clean renewable costs are coming down. This is happening, whether policy makes it happen or not. It sounds like you both disagree with that.
Well, it's happening, but the question is happening fast enough to make the 2-degree target? Yeah. But here in the US also an important point is that a lot of the policies are at the state level, not the federal level. So what's been driving wind and solar is more the renewable portfolio standards than the federal policies. Yeah. And that, I assume that that's going to stay in place because that's not something that the federal government controls. So if we continue with the sort of RPSs in place and we continue with some sort of reasonably tight CAFE standards, you'll certainly see some movement in that direction, but not enough. I think you would require a carbon tax, as Eirik was saying, $100 plus to really make this happen. And
we talk a lot about electric vehicles, but am I right looking at what you just presented that if we're going to get anywhere close to a 2-degree kind of target, energy efficiency improvements seem to make a bigger difference than a shift toward electrification? Is that what I took away from that?
Yeah, electrification.
When you look not only at light duty, but also the rest of the transportation.
The rest. Well, first of all, in spite of all the things that are happening on the electrification of cars, gasoline sales in the United States hit record levels last year. A lot of people are talking about all the electric vehicles now being put on the road in China, but the SUVs were 38% of the new car sales last year, 8.8 million new SUVs in China. So the electric vehicles don't make a dent yet. So things are going too slowly. Energy efficiency, one thing is standards. The good thing about electrification of light-duty vehicles is that an electric vehicle is more energy efficient than a combustion engine vehicle. But then on the general thing about energy efficiency is also that we have to make sure that we make it so much more efficient that we compensate for people's changes in behavior. The tendency we have to drive more when we have a more efficient car. We buy a bigger refrigerator when we buy a new one, because it's partly because the new one is more energy efficient. We continue to use the old one in our basement as a beer cooler, so the energy use goes up. So all that type of behavior is within these challenging numbers, right? And then when you look at the rest of transportation, you have to cater for what we think is a given, is that if we have economic growth at 2 to 2.7% per year, we have 2.4 billion more people, we will have more transport work, more demand for transport. So the vehicle miles, the aircraft miles will be more, and then that has to also be compensated by even higher improvements in energy efficiency.
Yeah, I was pulling up your slide here where you showed transport excluding light duty vehicles.
Yeah, that's 25 million barrels today, right?
But the difference here is not a different fuel mix. It's just
that's efficiency.
We're just using less energy to get the same amount of heavy duty transport and marine.
And to some extent, we as I mentioned, the urban structures that probably are better in a renewal scenario than in a reform and recovery scenario, then also reduces the necessary amount of transportation. I mean, if you don't have to drive 30 miles to get to the closest IKEA, then you can buy your stuff elsewhere, right? But of course, does that happen? Let's hope it does. But most of the world's cities are already built, and they are really difficult to make more efficient. So, but part of this will be also where the energy demand is growing the most, where we have a chance of planning how people should live,
and when we look
and whether that is happening.
When we look in here at the role hydrocarbons will still play in 2050, even in a 2-degree scenario, and you sort of noted how much investment is still needed because of decline rates, even in the 2-degree scenario. Nevertheless, if we don't achieve that, I'm just curious, what about carbon capture and storage is built into this? Does that create room in your model for the hydrocarbon demand, or would it look different without that CCS?
Well, without the CCS we had in, we would have a slightly more challenging and even more radical scenario, if you like. But we are not very optimistic on carbon capture and storage. If we were, we could afford to be less optimistic on decarbonisation and electrification and energy efficiency. If you look at the scenarios that are consistent with the 2-degree target that have been made, and there are many of them, most of them are relatively old, and they are much more optimistic on carbon capture and storage than what we are. But we have 1.5 billion tons taken out. It means that roughly close to 50% of the remaining coal-fired capacity on electricity, some of the gas-fired capacity, roughly 50% of coal-related industrial use, like in the cement factories and the steel factories, are assumed to be equipped with CCS. 1.5 billion tons. We have tried for several years to put a full-scale CCS plant into operation in Norway at our biggest refinery. That would take out 1 million tons per year. We haven't made it yet. It's really difficult. And we're located next to a reservoir where we can put the CO2, so there are some easy ways about it as well. If we were to be able to do that, if we did that now, and it was finished today, we would have to make another one every 8th day to 2050 to get to 1.5 billion. 1.5 billion is a big number. So those scenarios, if you look at the most recent ETP technology scenario that IEA put out a couple of weeks back, which is sort of what is technically possible, not economically or politically, they have a lot of CCS.
But I'm very skeptical about the potential for CCS. The economics just isn't there.
No, that's why we need $150 per ton.
Exactly right.
Right.
They
could
make it. Yeah.
You had, I think your quote was, you showed how, I think it was 2% of the total global energy mix is solar and wind today. Obviously rapidly growing, but it's growing off a very small base, so it takes time. And I think you said something like decarbonization hasn't started yet. I just want to ask you about kind of where we are in that. So you noted energy intensity has been declining. It's been declining for decades. Energy intensity of GDP has been declining. What is somewhat new is over the last just couple of years, we've started to see carbon intensity of GDP decline faster than energy intensity of GDP. Yes. Not only are we using energy more efficiently, but the fuel mix is starting to change. And we've seen global emissions roughly flat, a little up, a little down, but mostly flat for the last 3 years, which is a change.
Yeah,
and
very positive.
So I just want to ask kind of how you view that. Is that a small hiccup driven by changes in the growth structure in China, or is there something more fundamental that we're just at the beginning of now?
Well, it's probably a bit of both. It's a bit early to determine, because this also goes with, we see some examples in countries where it looks like we're about to decouple GDP growth from energy demand growth, which is one part of that equation, and the second one is to decarbonize. But part of that is probably driven by the structural situation that we're still at relatively low growth rates after the financial crisis. There is a restructuring going on in China that will temporarily impact that, where we don't know the long-term result. But part of it is also structural. There is something happening, but if on the other hand, we just had updated data from IEA. The big surprise there was that the CO2 concentration, the CO2 emissions, historically were actually higher than what we thought. So the urgency of starting to get this down is increasing, and the longer keeping coal demand constant in China doesn't cut it. China has to reduce its emissions by 60% to 2050. Their emissions now are 4 times what they were in 1990, so we have to bring that back to the levels they had by 1998, roughly, before the change of the millennium. 80% down in the United States, which we'll deliver on, by the way, in this scenario. 81% we deliver in Europe. The biggest challenge could be India. In these scenarios, we allow India's emissions to increase for a while due to the economic growth and the need to change out of very polluting biomass and into something else. But towards the end of the period, it starts to go down, and by 2050, India has 16% lower emissions than today in an economy that is almost 8 times as large. If you think that is virtually impossible, but then we have to figure out something else.
Your view, Geoff, on kind of what's happening right now with this decline in carbon intensity, flatlining of emissions?
Yeah, that's, you are seeing the beginnings, you're seeing partly, obviously, the transfer from coal to gas, particularly here in the US. And then the growth of wind and solar. And those are trends that are going to continue. As Eirik says, they need to not only continue, but to accelerate very considerably, and that's the real challenge there. You talk about the US, you said you're assuming the US gets its reduction emissions down by 80% by 2050. That obviously is technically feasible, but that's something I spent a lot of time looking at recently. And it's very challenging for the US to get there. It does require very active policy measures. And it's not just, we haven't talked about this so far, we talked about the technology, but this all requires a huge amount of infrastructure investment. Yes. The US would have to invest of the order of $4 or $5 trillion in new infrastructure in order to realize that 80% reduction. When you add that up around the world, we're talking about between $50 and $100 trillion worth of investment in new energy infrastructure over the next couple of decades. Yeah. And an interesting question is where exactly that money comes from, how that's mobilized. And a lot of the countries which have to make these investments don't have that kind of money. So it requires a lot of international capital flows. Yeah.
And that is, and by the way, there are studies that indicate that if Europe is going to decarbonize its electricity sector like this, we need a 7-doubling of the size of the grid to make that as efficient as possible. If we don't make it, it will be much more inefficient because you'll have too much solar in Spain and too much wind in Germany instead of having the possibility to...
Well, that's one of the big items in the US investment I was mentioning is actually improving the grid and providing storage capacity in order to smooth out the output of renewables. Yeah, absolutely.
No, and then on the sort of the 80% reduction is, by the way, not only in the US, but in our data, it's OECD Americas. So we have 80% reduction in Mexico and Canada and Chile as well. That's the region we're talking about. Right. But one of the things in the renewal scenario about who's going to pay, that's why we think it has, if we're going to have a reasonable chance, any chance of reaching the target, it has to take place in a very benign geopolitical climate, because we have to do a lot of burden sharing. Yes. We, in the West, the rich ones, might consider having to pay for these grid investments in India, making it possible with small-scale renewable electricity, big-scale renewable electricity, because they live in cities where you don't have room for a solar panel and a battery in the garage, and you don't have a car. So by 2050, Nigeria might be as large as the United States, or close. I mean, the population in Nigeria is the 4th largest then in the world. It might pass the US after 2050. How do we get them to tag along with a world where we say that the value of their most important export product, which is oil and gas, is going to be reduced significantly by a CO2 tax in China? So what type of burden sharing mechanisms do we have to make the emerging economies that are really dependent on resources And then so instead of wasting our time spending a lot of money on CO2 emission reductions that don't work here, that don't give the emission reductions, we should spend money on, stopping deforestation in the tropics, much more money. It's probably really cheap CO2 reductions. We should start talking about the forestry elsewhere than in the tropics. And we have to start talking about providing the technology and the capital to make that transition possible where it has to happen.
Now that, I really echo that point. I mean, stopping deforestation is the cheapest possible way of reducing CO2 emissions.
Yes.
You can do that for about $5 a ton,
Exactly.
$10 a ton. And that's something we should have jumped on hard a long time back.
Yes.
It's just extraordinary that we haven't.
No.
Yeah.
Give me your view, Eirik, on what's happening now in China and India. So, we saw when the U.S. withdrew from Paris, announcements, China's recommitting itself, it's serious about decarbonization. Do you see that playing out in the economy? Obviously, renewables are growing quickly, but like you just said, that's a lot of coal. That's sort of still there. Big plans to invest in nuclear too. Also India, where it seems like almost every day there's another statement from a government official that they're all in on coal, they're all in on renewables. Maybe it's both. And what does that mean for where global energy demand is headed? Not in the 2-degree scenario, but where are we headed today?
Yeah, I think the underlying demand for goods and services and activities that require energy is growing fast, and in particular in the countries where the economic growth is the fastest. I guess the good news is that there are significant things happening, both in China and in India, mainly driven by their own local interest in getting life quality up and reducing pollution. In China, that means that they will address coal use, at least near the big cities, probably. They will try to...
Have we seen peak coal in China?
No, but I don't think we're far away from it. Yeah. So it's, but we might have seen, but no, I think it's going to grow for a little while more. So, but peak oil in China, we have to reduce coal demand in the world by 2/3 to 2050, and more than 50% of the coal is being used in China. India, the same thing. We are lucky in that sense that the keys to our global common development, getting CO2 emissions down, are the development in countries which still have an individual interest, if you like, in reducing coal use and pollution. The trouble in India is that they could solve a lot of pollution problems by going from biomass to coal, and at the same time provide electricity for the people that don't have it, and there's hundreds of millions of them that don't have electricity. That's what China did in the 70s. Mm-hmm. So what we have to do is make it possible for India to help them, or let's hope they do it themselves, go from biomass, not to coal, but to something else that doesn't emit as much CO2 and doesn't give other types of local pollution.
I mean, you spoke about geopolitics a couple of minutes ago. I mean, you mentioned Nigeria and the problems of getting Nigeria to subscribe to a world order in which their principal export is devalued. But let's talk about Russia. Russia is a much more influential and important country than Nigeria. And Russia is heavily reliant on oil and gas exports. I mean, they've never really managed to diversify their economy. If your Renew scenario comes about, that has radical implications for Russia. And that presumably gives them relatively little incentive to collaborate on in sort of a cooperative scenario. What's your take on that?
Well, yeah, it's partly true. The good thing about Russia in a renewal scenario is that we all depend on their gas. Because if we're going to get China and the rest of Asia out of coal, we probably need a lot of gas from Russia, which makes it more interesting to talk about Russia.
The gas is a much smaller share of their energy export revenue than oil, though.
Yeah, and they have a lot. They use a lot of gas domestically, and they have a lot of gas. So that could actually be an extra export revenue for Russia if we need more gas. Right. Also for Russia, I guess their own interest is to make their energy sector much more efficient so that they can grow the economy faster. And Russia has the problem that the population is decreasing. So it's difficult to have per capita income growth significant. So they have to reform their own economy. And then also Russia is a very difficult country to run because it's so enormously big. And the cities are basically too small to be efficient. So they have to make their economy more efficient.
What does renewal mean for Norway and Statoil?
This is where I stop being an independent analyst and start talking a little bit about Statoil strategy. I guess what we believe in is that in all these, I mean, given that it's so uncertain which scenario that comes out of this, the smart thing to do is to be cost competitive, is to be carbon efficient, to continue to produce oil and gas as efficiently as possible, and our CO2 emissions are much lower than the global average. We will continue to make them even lower. The one challenge for Norway is that our electricity system is already decarbonized. We have 120% of our production in hydro, or of our demand in hydroelectricity production. So we export clean. But the problem with that is that we cannot decarbonize our electricity sector. So having lower local CO2 emissions in Norway means we have to attack the most difficult sectors, and that's transportation. Yeah. And that's really difficult in a country which has 13 people per square kilometer. I think we have 15 airports north of the Arctic Circle, and we fly more than anybody else. How do you decarbonize? So that's the challenge for Norway. So that's why. But the good thing is that let us start paying for deforestation more than we do, and then we contribute more to CO2 reductions than by.
And you are shifting very heavily to electric vehicles with very large government subsidies to make that happen, right?
Yeah, and I mean, it's not only the subsidies when you buy the car, but you need a lot of incentives to make the Norwegian consumers transform to electric vehicles. We can drive in a bus lane, we can park for free, we can charge them for free, we park close to the entrance of the shopping center. You can put them free on a ferry. There's no VAT when we buy new winter tires, which we have to do. So I mean, the incentives are enormous, and many of the electric, to be honest about it, many of the electric cars in Norway have been car number 2 or 3 in a family and has replaced public transportation. Yeah. If you can drive in a bus lane, why would you take a bus? so let's be honest about it. And with oil demand in Norway, gasoline demand in Norway, or gasoline and diesel demand in Norway is relatively flat, in spite of all these electric vehicles. So and now we have to reinforce our grids somewhere, because we love these mountain cabins. Yeah. And then when you drive with your electric vehicle to your mountain cabin and you boil your eggs on your induction oven, which is electric, right? In the Sunday morning, at the same time you charge your car, then the local grid companies has blackouts. So they have to start charging people for grid investments.
What is it? The premise of Geoff's question was that this, don't even say all the way to renewal, just in the talk of peak oil demand, the idea that oil demand will start to decline rather than continue to grow. And that would have a big impact on producers because of the impact on their revenue. And I'm just wondering what you think. So not in a 2-degree world, but let's assume peak oil demand occurs more quickly than some people think, and we start to see flatlining of demand, or maybe gradual decline. It's falling 500,000 barrels a day or 1 million barrels a day instead of rising 1 to 1.5 million barrels per day per year. What happens to oil prices? So and the reason I ask is because one would think, well, less demand means lower prices. Small changes in the supply and demand balance can have an enormous impact, as we've seen over the last 2 or 3 years. The flip side of that is you showed us that we still need a lot of new investment to offset declines. And to what extent would a change in the outlook for growth potentially deter, maybe more than it should, investment, and that could lead prices to be more volatile, to spike? Does less demand necessarily mean we're going to see much lower prices or not?
No, it doesn't mean that. I mean, fundamentally, over a longer period, the price has to be determined by the marginal cost of the marginal production. That is definitely lower in a scenario where we only need 60 million barrels than 120. But one of the key uncertainties when we reach peak oil, which could be in our central case around 2030, is how the market in that period reacts. And there's no reason to believe that oil and gas and electricity markets have stopped being cyclical or volatile. So there will be a lot of uncertainties. There will be a lot of stops and starts. And at some point, you could get to the point where some producers, some owners of reserves, most of them are national oil companies, right? But also IOCs, starts to think about, is it smart to continue exploration, or should I maximize the value of my remaining reserves? And if that happens, there is a risk that we miss and that we get these spikes and the gaps and so on. You could have a situation where some producers then get an incentive to just produce as much as we can now for the next 10 years to maximize the value. Yeah. But then we're definitely not in a renewal scenario. I mean, that's why we think going towards something that is consistent with the 2-degree target requires a set of global agreements and understanding and burden sharing that we can't have Saudi Arabia and Russia dump oil in the global markets if we think we're going to go in that way. So if we're not going in that direction.
Right.
So and that's why we have to compensate the losers here. But then we should, of course, not be surprised that we're going to have cyclical periods where we don't produce enough.
And just to highlight what you just said, a lot of talk about peak oil demand, and we just talked about electric vehicles, but in your central case, your reference for where things are headed, absent new technology and policy developments, you said oil demand peaks in 2030. So that's
around
pretty far
2030, and there's a lot of technology development in that one. Compared to other forecasts, we're really aggressive on electrification of the light-duty vehicles in that scenario as well. So this is not only about a renewable scenario. Just look at the shares.
And that's to offset.
If you go up 2 slides, you can
To offset the growth in transport
Yeah,
and
I mean,
petrochemicals and.
Yeah, and electrification in the OECD countries, more efficient combustion engines here, and go up. That one. Look to that's the share. It's 70% in a reform scenario in 2050 as well. So the reason why oil peaks in 2030 in that scenario is that the decline in oil, the flattening out of the vehicle density in the OECD countries, the electrification, the more efficient cars compensate for the growth in demand from light-duty vehicles and all other types of transport in emerging economies. So that's a balancing point that we think hit in 2030. But if we miss the car density in China by 5 percentage points, then we might get 2 million extra barrels, and it takes 5 more years before. So I mean, some of these countries are so big that they actually affect the point at which it peaks.
I want to open it up to questions, but I thought maybe we've talked a lot about peak oil demand, and Antoine, who's here, has thought a lot about this issue. So I don't know if you want to offer a comment on it. If not, we can go straight to questions. But I know you're working a lot on what the outlook for oil demand is. Do we?
Can I?
I'm going to ask Antoine Haft to make a quick comment, and then we'll take questions from the audience. Yeah.
I enjoyed your comments as usual. You focus very much on EVs in your big demand and renewal thing. And of course, if we are going to get to peak demand, we have to replace oil in many other applications. And one area that you pointed out where demand looks like very robust in any scenario is petrochemicals. But do you see some scope for displacement of oil there, either through maybe recycling and a reduction in demand for plastics, or through alternative feedstocks, maybe gas or maybe renewables?
Yeah, there is some scope, and I mean it's also some of the big uncertainties is that at what time do we have available alternative feedstocks from biomass or whatever? How quickly can we start recycling more of the polymers to produce the same amount again and again? Demand is growing in that sector, but it's not growing in line with GDP growth and population, but it is growing. There's not a lot of scope for efficiency improvements in the petrochemical industry as such. We don't. I mean, in the energy use it is, but not in the. We don't waste a lot of oil and gas when we transform it into polymers. So the conclusion on growth is we think is relatively robust. The conclusion that it will not grow in line with the GDP is relatively robust. And then there is an uncertainty about at what time and how do we potentially replace it, either by reuse or other type of feedstock. But that is difficult to see now. And there's something about it. There's a lot of news out there on new technologies. We just had some algae news from I think it was ExxonMobil. Very good. All those things that happen are very good. We probably need all of it. But the problem when you take on a global macroeconomic perspective that this has to be so enormous. It's so big. We talk about life cycle of a car. The life cycle of a Tupperware box is pretty high too. And a wall-to-wall carpet. So that is also, it has to start having an impact relatively rapid.
There were several questions up in the front. We'll start in the front row and then just work back and come over here.
Thank you very much.
Can you use just briefly, if folks could just briefly introduce themselves and keep your questions brief, please.
Hi, I'm I.K. Cush. I'm a correspondent with New African magazine. Just two quick questions. I would like you to comment. One of the largest coal companies in India announced a few days ago that they're going to close 37 mines. If you can just comment on that. But what I want to get to is the oil prices. Now, according to analysts, the market is out of balance, and they're projecting that the price of oil will fall to $20 a barrel next year. That's 2018, and then it will average $35 a barrel, which will trigger massive cuts. And I'm quoting here in U.S. drilling rigs. Do you see that? Do you share that? And if you do you also see that those price pressures triggering massive cuts in global drilling rigs?
Yeah, on the coal mine shutdowns, I mean, it's an indication that there's a lot of uncertainty about future coal demand. If coal demand doesn't decrease, then shutting coal mines will mean that you need the coal from somewhere else. There can be many different reasons why you shut a coal mine. It could be an unprofitable coal mine. It can be a lot of local pollution around the mine. And of course, it can be a move towards reducing the coal dependency of India or any kind of country. But until we see a significant reduction in the demand for coal itself, shutting a coal mine will just lead to either price increases or increased imports from elsewhere. But it is, of course, there's also now the cancelling of coal-fired power plants being built, which is a good signal, both in China and I've heard also in India. So which is an indication that they are serious about trying to move their economies at least away from the enormous coal dependence they have. And then it remains to be seen whether that is quick enough, whether it can be replaced by something else, whether they are then willing to increase their gas imports, which has a balance of trade issue for a country both like China and India. Oil prices can go both ways, can go up, can go down, not necessarily in that sequence. What we're seeing now is, of course, that yes, the market itself is imbalanced. The main indicator for that is overfilled storage. And it takes longer for the markets to rebalance than many people thought. We as oil producers all over the world have been fantastically good at increasing regularity and keeping production high, which is the incentive we have to sort of compensate our cash flow from the lower prices. So we see oil production increasing where it usually has been declining for quite a while. That cannot go on forever. We cannot improve regularity forever. Demand will grow, continue to grow. So at some point, the new investments are very low. So the flow of new projects coming in, with the exception of bank finance, the drilling in shale oil in the US, the amount of new projects coming in are very low. So at some point in the near future, the fundamentals of the market would indicate a tightening. But until then, all the financial traders can move the price up and down completely opposite to what the fundamentals would indicate, which is what we sometimes see as well. So, but a period of low oil prices for a couple of years now can definitely not be excluded. What you also cannot exclude is that once the markets start correcting, you could get a really rapid increase as well, while the fundamentals would indicate a relatively slow increase.
Great. So again, for those listening or watching online, I'm Jason Bordoff. I'm joined by Eirik Wærness, the chief economist at Statoil, and Geoff, a professor at Columbia Business School. Those watching online who want to ask questions can do so through Twitter with the hashtag CGEP events, and we'll continue with some questions here in the room.
Hi, I'm Duncan Dickerson from Lazard's M&A Group. And I thank you very much for taking the time. It takes a lot of courage to make a statement about what's going to happen over the next 50 years in energy, especially whenever you're affiliated with a public company. So that's thank you for that. I think the question's pretty simple. Both the rivalry scenario and the renewal scenarios rely on policy in order to either be interpreted as protectionist or subsidies or whatever have you. And a lot of policymakers would interpret both the policy that you claim is necessary for the revival scenario as ones that would be, so the renewal scenario, ones that would be applicable to the rivalry scenario. And so how do you create a bright line between that and make an objective statement about what policies are applicable to which scenarios so that everyone can agree on that? And if they can't, do you think it's a tool that you should rely on in order to have any of these outcomes?
That was an easy question, but not an easy question to answer. No, first of all, I think that if you look at the individual regions or countries and you compare the policies in the rivalry scenario and in the renewal scenario, you can see a lot of the same in some regions. For instance, we think that the energy and climate policies will be relatively tough in EU, both in the rivalry scenario and in the renewal scenario. Maybe even tougher. In some other countries, there's going to be a much bigger change if you go to from the rivalry to the renewal scenario. So you'll have a bit of both. What is important is that things like adjusting in a renewal scenario, you don't have to compete. You don't necessarily have to compete between countries on things like border adjustment taxes for carbon, because we all agree we're going to put it in place, right? We're going to have the Middle East countries take away all fossil fuel subsidies. That's definitely not going to happen in a rivalry scenario. And they will do that in that type of conducive political climate that we think is there. We might still have corporate border adjustment taxes in the rural case, but that's to make sure that we as businesses are held in line, in check, right? So that we don't move the production out of a country with a carbon tax that somebody has to lower for a period. But I guess the difference also between the rivalry and the renewal scenario is that the consequence of policies, the consequence of conflict, reduces economic growth in a rivalry scenario. So the ability to promote technological development, the amount of public money available, if you like, to drive and foster the type of technology development that we need in a renewal scenario are not there in the rivalry scenario. The global economic growth is much lower. We have some regions that have significantly lower economic growth and absolutely not the money available. So it's that overall. So there's not a clear line, but it's sort of but there are two very different worlds in how they act. And don't underestimate the importance of policies in the reform scenario as well. I might have misled you there, but we assume that the Paris Agreement is not only targets, it's actually measures that drive that for 10, 15 years now, and we're very far away. Hardly any policy measures have been put in place to follow up the promises in the Paris Agreement yet. Hopefully that will come pretty soon. There's a lot of policy there as well.
There's a question here, and then we'll go here. Yeah.
Thank you. I'm Charlie Kimball with the Korea Center for International Finance. I'd like to hear more about shale oil and the impact this could have over the period to 2030, 2050. And it has something to do with how much capacity is there, not just in the United States, but globally. Can it be expanded out over that long a period of time to Argentina, China, or even Russia, I don't know, other places? Because when you talk about Russia and Saudi Arabia dumping oil, it seems to me like shale oil. We don't call it dumping, but it's essentially putting low price oil out there that would affect the renewal scenario if it can go on for decades.
Yeah, a couple of points, I guess. It is low price oil, but I guess still the question is up whether the total industry, shale oil industry as a whole, is actually making money. So I mean, when does the industry as a whole become cash flow positive? So yes, by $50, it's proven to be very resilient, and by $50, $55, the number of rigs increase, and we have the banks finance the drilling, and the production comes out. What the necessary price level over time is for that to be sustainable is still up for grabs.
But still much lower than we thought.
Yeah. But the same thing. I mean, the marginal cost of a marginal oil sands project in Canada is also much lower than we thought 3 years back. We've taken down the break-even prices of an offshore field in the Arctic from $80 to $35 over the last 2.5 years. We haven't still decided to invest, but the break-even price is more than 50% lower. So everything has come down, and then to what extent that is sustainable is a question. In our forecast, one thing is that we have to put the shale oil revolution into perspective. We're talking about something that is still less than 10% of non-OPEC production. So 4 or 5 million barrels per day. Non-OPEC production is 65 million barrels per day. Keeping 65 million barrels per day of conventional non-OPEC oil production is an enormous challenge. In the scenarios, we have shale oil in the United States peaking at around 10 million barrels per day, closer to 2030. A little bit differing on what scenario we're in. If you're in the renewal scenario, we need much less shale oil production. And in that scenario, we allow the cheapest producers, which is OPEC, to produce what they can. In the rivalry scenario, where there's a lot of conflict in the Middle East, the Middle East will struggle to deliver as much, and then we depend more on shale oil to satisfy the market. We're not very optimistic on the development of shale oil outside of North America or outside of the US. There will be some. The main reason is, well, there are many reasons. One is, of course, that there's a lot of above ground reasons why this took off in the United States. Another reason is that there is a lot of conventional resources available in the areas where you potentially could find shale oil, and then it's a matter of cost. What do you do first? Just imagine under the reservoirs of West Siberia, there's a shale formation, there's a source rock, which probably contains a lot of oil, but as long as we have a lot of resources above it, we don't need it. Nobody has looked under the Ghawar field in Saudi Arabia yet either. There's probably a lot of source rock there. So, but it's a matter of what resources do you develop first. If it turns out that it's difficult to produce sufficient amounts of conventional oil to satisfy demand in 2040, whether that is 100 or 80 million barrels, we're going to have more shale oil to satisfy. But that's a matter of cost. But we are not very optimistic on sort of shale oil taking 30% of the market.
Yeah, I mean, for me, it sort of comes back to the point before about, like, is this sort of transition inevitable and how important is policy? Because it's just a reminder of the fact that as quickly as clean energy costs will decline because of technological improvements, companies like yours and the hydrocarbon sector is pretty innovative as well, as bringing down the cost and developing new technologies to extract oil and gas. And so if we're serious about reducing emissions and reducing demand, policy is going to have to help drive that, because we can continue to see new innovative forms of extraction.
No.
Well, a lot of the reduction in the cost of shale oil has actually been on the back of the oil field supply companies, hasn't it? And their margins have reduced. A lot of those have been operating at a loss just in order to keep their stuff active. And that's not, I think you said earlier, actually, that's not a sustainable situation. So we're going to have to see some of the costs in the shale actually going to go up rather than down.
There was a question here in the front row. And then
Hi, good morning, Yusuf Bahami. My question in regards of the perspective analysis, does it take in consideration and adhere within the Sustainable Development Goals of the Agenda 2030? You mentioned the Paris Agreement earlier, but in the context of action of the SDGs, did you take that in consideration in the study? Thanks.
I mean, that's a very good question. I mean, the whole setting that we're putting this in, and which is one of the reasons why the renewal scenario is extremely difficult, is that if you take into account the other sustainable development goals, the ones that sort of were updated by the UN a little bit under the radar just before Paris, they are enormously challenging too. We are supposed to provide clean, affordable, and available energy for everyone by 2030. That's 13 years down the road. That means to take, what do we do with the 2.4 billion people that rely on polluting biomass for their heating and cooking? What do we do with the 1.2 billion people that don't have electricity? And we've used 130 years to electrify 6 billion people. And we have 35 years to electrify 3.6 billion people, if you take the 1.2 that don't have at the moment and then the 2.4 that are going to be born. It's an enormous challenge. Part of that is we don't have data on whether every Indian and every African has access to electricity in 2050, but a lot more of them will have with this type of development that we have in both our scenarios. And it's one of the reasons why it's so difficult to get energy intensity down, is that we need to provide more of it. The local pollution consequences of decarbonizing the electricity sector will improve quality of life and lifespans and so on. Whether we have enough water for everyone or enough food is outside the realm of our models, but that's another challenge within the Sustainable Development Goals. But generally, avoiding global warming should make it easier to avoid too many problems in terms of water and food as well. But that's not a given, and it's not the same all over the world. So, but it's something that I hope IPCC addresses when they do their new reports.
When you look at where we are today, how do you view the economic competitiveness of renewable forms of energy, and what do you expect? Will we see the continued decline in cost as we've seen recently, the kind of growth rates we've seen recently, and do they, to what extent are they now competing on their own, in some cases with, in some cases without government support, and also on offshore wind, which is something Statoil knows a fair amount about.
Yeah.
Well, it's a bit uncertain. I mean, the real competitiveness at the moment is a bit uncertain because definitely the costs have come down. They become more competitive at the margin. Most renewable electricity projects compete within systems that already operate. The grid exists. To some extent, you could say that they piggyback on somebody else having the capacity when they don't produce. They never pay the whole costs of the system. In this highly announced auction in Chile in September, I think it was last year, where solar sets a new low price record, part of the story is that, first of all, the solar panels are placed in probably the best place in the earth for solar electricity generation, which is in the Atacama Desert. Nobody lives there, so nobody needs the electricity. So the Chilean government is paying for the grids necessary. And the Chilean government in the same auction bought coal-fired backup capacity at double the price. So the system price is something that we still have to see. It's probably going to come down, continue to come down, but one big uncertainty is what if we grow the lithium demand by 25 times, which is what we do in the renewable scenario. 20 times more of some rare earth minerals, a lot more cobalt. Where's the availability of those types of minerals? We assume that they will be available at gradually lowering cost. But we're not going to see the same rate of cost improvement over the next 30 years as we have seen over the last 30 years. We're pretty sure about that. So and offshore wind still requires subsidies in the terms of some kind of guaranteed price. And then one of the challenges is who's going to provide that type of security? Is it the markets? Do we have a market regulation where that happens? Or is it the government that sort of ends up with the final bill? And the costs are coming down. And one of the good things about offshore wind is that we can make the windmills bigger. There's still technology development possible there. We can make them much bigger offshore than we can do onshore. Right. We can't move the largest windmills offshore. We can't move them on land anymore. So that's one of the things. You can actually make them much bigger. And we can still learn about the best places to put them in terms of wind conditions.
Do you have a quick comment before we go back?
Well, just on this issue of scarcity of lithium, things like that. I actually spent quite a lot of time recently talking to battery experts and people who are specialists in electrochemistry. They suggest that actually battery technologies are going to be moving away from lithium and a lot of these rare earth elements within the next decade. So that shortage is not likely to be a real constraint.
No, but then we might have to find out. I've also talked to some. I mean, sulfur could be a candidate.
Yeah, right.
The issue with the sulfur is that we probably have enough. We know how to handle the wastes, but the energy density there is much lower now.
Yeah,
so then we need the technology, and we have to repeat the same type of learning and improving to make that happen.
Well, so that for grid batteries, energy density is not such a big issue. Energy density is an issue for car batteries.
Yes.
Yeah.
Anything that moves.
Yeah. Right.
There was a question for a woman in the middle there. Yeah. Thanks.
Good morning, Shaheen from Bloomberg ESG. So I think the EV forecast was very interesting, and from the chart behind, I was just wondering how electric vehicles are categorized. And I see this is more than plug-in hybrids. So I was just wondering what is driving that. And then also just to follow up to that, so I thought Statoil's forecast was, a lot more ambitious than the other oil and gas majors. So just curious as to your thoughts on that, and again, what drives this? Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah. When we say electric vehicles here, at least for the first part of the development here, we think it's the battery electric vehicles that are sort of looking as the most potential and the most likely winning technology. When you get further out, it might be electric vehicles. If the technology development continues, a chunkable part of that might be hydrogen and fuel cells. but we have sort of put our bets on the battery electric vehicles. Whether you have plug-in or electric vehicles might not matter as much as long as the technology development also for plug-in vehicles continue. So the combustion part of that will go down as well, and they will be more competitive cost-wise. The problem for a plug-in hybrid is that you have double technology, and then so to start with, it's a more expensive car. But that will be different. Yes, we are ambitious or aggressive, or we're even more ambitious than Bloomberg New Energy Finance on electric vehicles, much more. So and in a sense, so let's hope we might be wrong, but then we have an even bigger challenge in terms of delivering the 2-degree target. So we can hope we're right.
There was a question here in the front row.
Hajime Matsura of Sankei, and also thanks for doing this. If I may, I would like to ask a more myopic question. I'm interested in this recent development of uncertainty in the GCC nation, which is we're seeing sort of a big regime change in individual countries. And I was wondering how this could impact your model, and also more short-term, what's your analysis on this and the consequence to fuel energy market?
Yeah, you're talking about the Middle East, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
I mean, especially GCC.
The Gulf, yeah, GCC.
Used to be very stable.
Well, first of all, I guess it's when you do scenario analysis long term, like we do, we're always on a constant outlook for signposts as to which of these scenarios become less or more likely, and we find a lot of signposts for all the scenarios if we look carefully. The type of political development that we see now in the Middle East is an indication that the way we describe the rivalry scenario actually has some value. And having conflicts of different kind and of that type going on, where they don't have to be as tragic and terrible as what has happened in Syria and Libya, but the other types of tensions in an area which is so crucial to global energy markets it's always problematic. To what extent that will have long-term implications for oil and gas supply is difficult to say. That depends on how the conflict continues to develop. This is not the only place in the world where we have a lot of conflicts. So a scenario as benign and kumbaya-like the renewal scenario is something we can hope for, but it's not out there. So, and then if it's rivalry scenario at least in some parameters, then it's going to make it more difficult to have the type of technology development and economic growth that we have. Short term, it remains to be seen, I guess. That the markets, as I said, the markets the last weeks have reacted a bit strangely to different types of news indicating fundamental changes, whether it's some indication of storage changes or it's this type of conflict. The price of oil has gone down. So you'll have to ask the guys who trade with papers instead of actual oil why that is so. But of course, any kind of increased risk of supply disruption from key Middle East Gulf oil producers is going to drive the price up.
You know, we do these events pretty regularly, but we also do events every week virtually, which is what a podcast is. And so last week's podcast episode for Columbia Energy Exchange was a conversation with Halima Croft and Bernie Hakel from Princeton about the Qatar conflict. So I encourage people to listen to it if you haven't. We have time for just one, maybe two more questions. There's a question in the back there, and then we'll go over here if we can.
Good morning, David Sonnerworth from the Bank of New York Mellon. I'm actually interested in the interplay between investment capital and regulation. I think in your scenario, you had indicated that electrification is going to increase, especially with EVs. And here in this country and in most Western countries, rate regulation has provided a fairly stable source of funding, consistency in returns and given comfort to investors. And investors are normally looking for, the highest expected return on a risk-adjusted basis. How do you see that developing, especially as we consider, things like distributed generation, continued digitization of the electrical industry, a lot of competing players coming into that space, and how do we still provide, a pathway for investment to make that happen, especially when we're talking about trillions of dollars?
No, and that is one of the absolute most difficult issues to handle in the transition to a distributed, much more decarbonized electricity system, which has to produce more electricity or deliver more electricity because different parts of the energy spectrum is becoming electrified. And we don't have the response to that yet. It's something that we have to assume happened. There's no country in the world now that is able to guarantee a rate of return for investments in new renewable electricity that is satisfactory if you take it 10 years down the road. I mean, the German Energiewende now is an example that, large parts of the year they give away electricity to the neighboring countries, and they actually have to pay to put it on the grid. So how do you get consumers might be incentivized to put a solar panel on our roof if we have the room for it, but then the flip of that is that how do we get those consumers to stay energy efficient in the future? What type of regulatory regime do we need to have in place to make sure that the surplus electricity is put on the grid rather than just being wasted? In Norway, we don't turn off the light when we leave a room because electricity has been cheap for 100 years. We probably have a temperature in our houses during the winter which is 2 degrees higher than necessary. You guys, you cool down your houses much too much. I mean, why have it? What is it, 100 degrees outside and 59 inside? All Europeans get a cold when you come to the United States in the summer, right? Because of going in and out of it. So how do we get that to happen? How do we drive energy efficiency? And how do you make incentives to invest in backup capacity in the electricity systems as well? There's an enormous need for re-regulating electricity markets. It's also the perception. We've just talked about the volatility in oil and gas prices, but if you look at some of the most efficient electricity markets in the world, for instance in the Nordic countries, the volatility in the electricity prices are much higher than in the oil and gas prices. There's no certainty for future electricity prices for somebody who invests either.
All right, we unfortunately we're out of time, but I think that we didn't get to all the questions. So hopefully you can come back and join us and answer all the questions again.
And you can send them to this guy.
Thanks, Eirik, for joining us while you're in the United States. Thanks, Geoff, for joining us as well to offer your thoughts and perspectives on the panel. Thanks to all of you for being here. Our next event will be July 13th. With the executive director of the IEA, Fatih Birol, who will be presenting their 5-year outlook for the global natural gas markets. And all our events, as always, will be available online. And please listen to our weekly podcast as well, which comes out every Monday afternoon. Thanks. Please join me again in thanking Eirik Wærness for joining us today.